Start recording. Okay, so a few years back, I gave a presentation at ECGC, East Coast Game Conference. If you're interested, that is something we'll be going to again this year. It's in April, and Katie is one of the people you need to talk to about that. So it's a student trip. We usually take about 15 people, and I like having a mix of all sorts of different people, concept artists, animators. So there's a process for that, but it's a school-funded trip. So although you may have to pay for some stuff, like your food and stuff like that, the hotel, the drive, and the ticket is actually covered by us. So if that's something you're interested in, we'll talk more about that. Anyway, this is an adapted version of a presentation I gave at that conference, and I realized at some point that this is actually the lecture that I had been giving an adapted version of this using other resources. So I've kind of taken it and twisted it around a little bit and turned it into a full PowerPoint presentation. Hopefully will be less boring than a lot of other PowerPoint presentations. But to give you an idea, there are 285 slides in this. It is 3:55, and I think I can be done with this thing by 4:35, because this is a really quick one. Right? Yes? I don't know if I can do that to YouTube. I can put it up on the network for you if you'd like, but basically I'm recording the video of this presentation, so it'll have the whole PowerPoint on there. But yeah, if you want the PowerPoint presentation, I can give you that too. So pose to pose. I did this one because, well, before I jump into that, let's talk about where we're pulling this idea from, right? It's the 12 principles of animation, right? And we hear pose to pose. There are two principles in here that a lot of this is going to be pulling from. So there's straight ahead action and pose to pose, right, which is one of the 12 principles. And then there's staging, right? These are the two principles that pose really is heavily influenced by or pertains to pose, right? So let's talk about them quickly again. Straight ahead animation, you create the frames in consecutive order. So it's like stop motion animation, right? Like you create frame 1, frame 2, frame 3, frame 4, and all the way to the end of it. If you want your character to raise their hand, you start with the hand down, and one frame at a time you raise the hand, right? This principle is really just talking about the process of creating an animation. The other method, the one that more people use, and the one you kind of used in this last project with Hobo, was pose-to-pose animation, right? That's where the keyframe animator does the main poses, right? And then the in-betweens are done by an assistant. Your assistant is Maya, right? And Maya doesn't make very creative decisions. And so it will just kind of tween in between those, right? So one of the reasons that this is important, the keyframe animation, or the keyframes are important, is because if you have strong keyframes, in theory, what Maya gives you for these in-between keyframes will be a little better, right? They're not going to be amazing. They'll still need some work. But if you have like a really terrible keyframe and another really terrible keyframe, the in-betweens are likely going to be terrible too, right? So if we can make these strong key poses, then Maya will give us a better interpolation in between there. So strong poses equal strong in-betweens. So just to look at some key poses, this is a series of drawings by Milk Call. And these are all of his key drawings, or all of his drawings, but you'll see the ones that are his keyframes, right? And so I love looking at these. The ones that are his keyframes, let me go back one. You see these little tick marks on the side here? That's usually the keyframe animator draws that to show you how to interpret between those, right? And so the cool thing about this is it's really just, this owl character is really just a ball, right? This isn't that much different than Hobo that you just animated. And just look at some of the neat things that are happening in these poses, right? Every one of these drawings is a drawing that I would love to frame and hang on my wall, right? Milk Call was actually incredible at posing. So the other principle we're going to talk about is staging. or let me rephrase that. The other principle that pose relates to is staging. And so a lot of times when we're talking about staging, we're talking about how we present information to the audience on a picture plane, right? So that could include stuff like your foreground, middle ground, background. It could also include, like we talked earlier, I don't know if we talked about this stuff or not, about rules of thirds, like your composition of this frame, or just like how we use our negative space, right? Yeah, this is possibly one of my favorite frames of animation of all time. Like, I love this image. And it's just like, I love it, everything about it. So, pose. When we talk about this, like, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say something that I think would cause arguments at times, but pose, like understanding how to craft a good pose is, in my opinion, the single most important thing an animator can do, right? Weak poses, you just can't turn weak poses into a good animation. And the reason I say that is because we can look at this one image and know a lot about what's going on based off of this pose, right? This upstanding individual is knocking on your door wanting to come in for a cup of tea, right? Like, there's so much that can be conveyed in a pose about the character's personality. We also learn about the character's relationship to the scene and the camera. Like, we are below Wolverine, who is flailing at us while on fire. That is not the place you want to be, right? There's a lot of things that we learn about the character, our situation, everything, and their personality and emotions from the pose, right? So, the problem with this is a lot of poses are boring, and what we're going to learn today is how to make a pose not boring. So, it's actually simpler than you might think. It's not like a long list of rules. There are really three things that go into a strong pose, which is contrapposto, line of action, and silhouette. Most of you have heard all of these words before. We're going to look at all three of them and sort of break them down a little bit to learn how to use them when crafting an animation. So we'll start with Boring Franklin. This is a free rig you can download, I think, from Artella. And like by default, he comes in pretty much at this pose. His arms are out at the T pose. I put his arms down, and this pose is boring. Right? There's nothing appealing about this, and we're going to talk about how to make it better. So the first thing we need to talk about is sort of the physics in this. Right? The physics that is happening, or we want to imply is happening, is that gravity is pulling him downward. Right? Both of his feet are planted on the ground, right? And since his feet are planted on the ground, they're pushing back on the ground, according to Newton, with an equal and opposite amount of force, right? To keep him off of, keep him from collapsing. So we can look at this sort of base of support that we have there, and everything above that base of support is being supported by those two forces, by that force of him pushing against the ground, right? So if we lift one leg off the ground, that is no longer his base of support, right? Now this is his base of support, and you'll see this large amount of area outside of that that is not being supported. Gravity is still pulling down on that, so Franklin falls over, right? That is how weight works. This is something that we have to do as an animator, is learn to shift our character's weight appropriately. So if I want Franklin to feel like he's staying in balance, I shift his weight over that base of support, right? Now he's sort of evenly distributed over that leg. It takes a newborn human about a year to learn to do this on their own. That's why they go stumbling around everywhere. Like, just that weight shift from leg to leg takes a year for us to learn how to do that. It takes animation students about 3 years to learn how to do that with their character. It is probably one of the things that I critique the most, is like your character has to shift their weight. So you can never, ever, 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 ever raise one of your character's feet off of the ground without shifting their weight over the other leg. no matter how fast it is, whatever it is impossible to do it. You can stand up and try what Franklin was unable to do yourself. I cannot raise one of my feet off the ground without shifting my weight over that basic support, unless I'm falling, right? If you want to make your character fall, that makes sense. But, so, contrapposto, our first note about this, or our first element of pose, is because of this weight shift, right? If we think of contrapposto, how many of you have heard this before, that phrase before, right? Contrapposto just means, it's Italian for countering pose, or you know, counter pose, counter posture. Our history teachers love this word, but really all it means is that your shoulders and your hips are at a contrasting angle to each other, right? So here's Franklin, and we look at his hip and shoulder relation. They are perfectly parallel, and parallel is boring, right? We put some angles on those. Yay, contrapposto. The poster child for contrapposto is this fella right here. Michelangelo's David is used as an example all the time. In fact, if you look up contrapposto in Wikipedia, that's where I download this image from. Contrapposto, again, you can see this. He has a countering angle in his hips and his shoulders. The reason for that is because his weight is over his right leg, right? And so that means the weight is being pushed up that hip and causing his angle, or his hip to be at an angle. He's also sort of reaching with his other foot, right, to make sure it stays on the ground, to make sure it's still there for balance reasons, right? Now, if David's spine, as a human being, if David's spine were like a single like metal rod, right, unbendable, then that means his spine would now be angled like that, right? But it's not. Our spine's made up of a whole bunch of segments, and so it can bend, it can contort, and so we get this curving angle. His shoulders are sort of crossing that curved end at a tangent, right, at a countering angle there. And that's how we end up with contrapposto. It's because our spine bends. Our hips lean to keep us in balance, and our spine bends to keep us from tipping over and falling because we're out of balance, right? So, again, Franklin, boring pose. It's a little less boring. He's up on one leg, right? But it's a boring pose. If we give his hip a little bit of an angle, because he's raising this leg, that means he kind of pulls that hip up. Now again, if his spine were fused, that's what we would get. But his spine can curve, so we can do this, and so we get a slightly less boring, a slightly more interesting or appealing pose, right? Contrapposto is everywhere. If you're in motion, that means your hips are changing angle, and your spine is contorting, and your shoulders are countering that angle in order to keep you in balance, right? So, and you can just see this contrapposto happening back and forth in this walk cycle. Of course, we can push that more or less. Contrapposto isn't just a lean to one side, though. It's also a twist, right? So your spine is also twisting and countering in that way as well, right? It's an element of a character that we build from the ground up. I know there are several people in here who are interested in concept art, and 2D character design, all of that stuff. This is the model sheet of Gaston, and they have to draw him very stiff with no contrapposto. But from the very early stages of crafting his animation, they built that contrapposto into it. So you can see he has this countering angle in the hips and shoulders, and that was part of the planning of his acting. Without that contrapposto, Gaston does not have a swagger, right? And then that means Gaston is not Gaston, right? So contrapposto, like we can use this concept. It's not necessarily always called contrapposto. We can use this concept all over the place. So yeah, Bob's shoulders are leaning, but look at the contrast between his eyebrows and mouth, right? And the reason this is happening is because it opens up this side of his face to be receptive to this person he's talking to, right? If you want to close him off, you could do the opposite of that. Okay, so that's contrapposto, and we'll see more examples of it here in a few minutes. The second element of making your pose less boring, line of action. So, Line of action is often confused with arc. Arc means that you could draw an invisible path along the line in which your object is traveling, and it creates an arc in the motion. This is, if we pause on a single frame, can we draw an invisible line through our character's pose that tells us something about the energy and the sort of flow of the masses through that pose, right? And if your line is not sort of smooth, you end up with an awkward pose, right? So, like, yeah, this one that is marked right, it's been pushed to where that line of action is very clear, but the one where the line of action is unclear, like, that would be even hard to get into that position, right? So really, there's a lot of anatomical reasons that we see these lines of action. We can push them and use them, though, for animation purposes. Right now, the one marked right, his line of action is sort of this curve to screen left, right? And if we just change that line of action to curve to screen right, we get the contrast of that. We get this reversal of that line of action to get that motion, right? So if we look at Franklin again, right, and we look at his spine, it's got a curve in it because of that contrapposto. And if we just sort of follow the ends of that spine curve out through the end, we can start to see his line of action. So Franklin's line of action isn't very clean, right? It's got a weird little hitch and bobble through it. So all we really have to do to fix that is just sort of push him a little bit and get a cleaner line of action. Okay? So this gives us a stronger feel to this. And our line of action tells us a lot about sort of the character's personality or emotion, right? And just by playing with that, we can change it. So we have this where this feels a little stiff, and it's because Contrapposto is very parallel and his line of action is pretty straight. Whereas this feels much more relaxed and has more personality to it. And that's just because we got more Contrapposto and a different line of action, right? When I was making this PowerPoint, I labeled this one boring nerd. However, if we just change our camera angle, and it's like he's got this very boring Contrapposto line of action, right? We just change our camera angle, and now look at this line of action, this upwardly mobile tech guru. There's a lot that line of action can be adjusted just by the way you're looking at your character. So your camera is very important in this. Line of action is usually, in a moving character, tells us something about the path in which the character's traveling, right? This character, or this kid is obviously sort of diving in that direction, right? And so his arc often kind of aligns with his line of action. Now, your line of action is something we think about for every single pose of the animation. In fact, all of these posing techniques is something we think about every pose of the animation. Because we can see that most of this animation was crafted just by thinking about the line of action. Basically, this line is throwing a ball. All of that character's limbs are almost secondary to that, right? Line of action doesn't necessarily, we can use this same concept the same way we used with Bob's eyebrows and Contrapposto. We can use this with other limbs, right? Or other parts of the character. So with that swipe there, we see we have line of action, but we also have this and this, right? So sometimes your line of action or not your line of action, you can take that Contrapposto line and carry that out through the arms, and making that line of action smoother also changes the appeal to the pose, right? Now, using some examples from my own work, this is Harold Hardrada. I don't know if I talked to you about this one or not. When I was working on this piece, this was his greetings, I am a big awesome Viking, and he's very proud in this. He's gloating. Yeah, bloating. He's bloating. Yeah. He pillaged too much. So he's gloating. And so his line of action is very proud, right? It feels like his chest is pulling him forward, right? Versus this is the pose you get after you defeat him, right? And if you look at this, his line of action curled down, and it feels like his head is sort of pulling him down. Right? Now, back to old poster child here. His line of action isn't very smooth, right? It's got a little bit of a wrinkle to it. It's almost like it's a like kind of curve, like it's not a very smooth line of action. But if you think about that, that's what the whole point of this sculpture was, right? David is, this is a giant piece of stone, right? Like this thing weighs like probably thousands of pounds, at least multiple hundreds of pounds, right? And Michelangelo was able to make it look like a fleshy character that is sagging on himself, right? And so if you think of that line of action, he's got his weight over that, and he's supposed to be feeling like he's kind of like drooping, like he's like that weight has settled down, right? And that line of action is intentional. Like if you tried to stand up a piece of like soggy spaghetti, right? It's going to kind of crinkle in on itself in that same way. And I think that line of action is intentional for that reason. Again, we're going to find these appealing lines, these appealing curves everywhere, right? We got line of action, 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 line of action. All of these are just lines, these smooth, swooping lines that we can draw that we will find more appealing if they're smooth, right? If his shoulders were slightly at too sharp of an angle, this just wouldn't feel as cohesive, right? So we have complete control of that, and that's something that we should leverage. Now, third thing to make our pose look a little bit better, silhouette. Right? So this is where we play a game. You ready? Interactive time. Everybody awake? Here we go. I'm going to pop a silhouette up on the screen, and you're going to tell me who or what it is. Ready? Okay. It was his, apparently it's his 90th birthday. There was a Mickey Mouse 90th birthday celebration on TV the other night. It was kind of lame, but Mickey's still awesome, right? Yes, Mickey Mouse. And like that, it's not an accident that we can all recognize that shape, right? That is very iconic. We can recognize it completely from the character's silhouette, right? Ready for number 2? Here we go. Bugs Bunny, right? So we are actually silhouette spotting machines. Like we are great at spotting silhouettes because we need to be able to quickly recognize that's the shape of a tiger or that's the shape of an antelope. One of those is delicious. One of those will kill you. So we have to be able to spot that quickly, right? We have brains that are sort of mapped out to be able to do that. So keep going here. Ready for number 3? It's me, Mario. Okay, here's another one. Lara Croft. Even though I'm not a huge fan of this pose because like that silhouette arm, like she's aiming at us, like that could have been a little better of a silhouette there, but very clear to recognize her, right? How about this one? Pikachu. Yeah, I captured him in Knoxville not too long ago. There we go. Okay, ready? One more? I know y'all know this one. Tracer. I knew this one and I've never played Overwatch, right? So this is not accidental, right? This is not accidental. This is designed so you can spot these characters, you can read these characters quickly. These are very fast-paced games, and you need to know TF2. You need to know who's going to heal you and who's going to kill you, right? Like these are in the designs of creating very strong silhouettes so it's quickly noticeable. We can do this with humans too. It doesn't have to just be with cartoon characters. What is this? Beatles. Anybody know the album? Abbey Road, right? What about this fella? Anybody? It's a president. Nixon. He's not a crook, right? So this next one is from a movie. Just kind of a hint, because this is the one that people have a little bit of trouble with. See if you can figure this one out. Ready? Shawshank Redemption. It's Andy Dufresne, right?
You know that.
So,
That's how I know.
So we're great at spotting these, and that means you have to use that as a communication medium, right? Your audience needs to be able to spot your pose, what your character is doing, just as quickly, right? So what is Franklin doing? Right, it's not quite clear, is it? Whereas if we just turn him a little bit, well,
he's opening up a box.
So he's contemplating a box in some way, right? And just by changing that pose between those two, we at least get enough information to know Franklin's thinking about this box in his hand, right? It's a Rubik's Cube, and he's almost there. Look at that. Look how close he is. Just one more turn, Franklin, but he's going to mess it up. So, whereas, like, if we look at this one a little longer, we would see all those things too, but it's just a little less clear. Just by breaking out his silhouette a little bit more, you're able to spot that quicker, right? So we can do this of a variety of ways, right? We can do Pikachu. A lot of this is about his negative space, the negative space around the character. And those shapes that make up that negative space are easy to spot quickly, right? It's also about repeating or contrasting patterns. We get this straight line on this side, this lumpy line on this side, this very distinctive zigzag here, right? So again, it's the shapes that this character makes on a negative space background that tells us about the character, right? Who is this person? It's a ballerina, right? And it's because that is the shape that only a ballerina makes, right? What about this?
How long his leg is.
I know. Like, this is a baseball pitch, and we even are able to tell specifically what part of the game is happening from this versus this. This is the hit, right? And so these are, the interesting thing about this is these moments are happening in a fraction of a second, right? This instant right here determines like a game. Like that happened over the weekend. I can't remember which team it was that missed a field goal and lost the game, right? This one here determines whether this guy's ribs are broken or not, right? These are very significant moments. And the thing about this in animation, why this is important, is because these moments don't hang around long enough for us to like sit and stare at them. We can stare at the still image, but I have an animation here we're going to look at. This is actually something I did for Gearbox on Gears of War. It's an attack sequence, so it's a 1-2 attack, right? So it's hit, hit, right? So let's look at this frame by frame. So this is frame 28, 29, 30, and 31, that's the hit. And then immediately, one frame after that, it's over. So this is 30 frames a second. That means you get 1/30th of a second for that impact to read. And if that pose isn't clear, it's not going to read. Again, frame 44, 45, the impact, 46, it's over, right? These very important moments in these actions are fleeting. They have to be clear. They're not going to hang around for a long time so your audience can read them. It has to be clear. And it's one of the things that makes it so impressive, like so interesting and so like catches your eye. Right? This is an awesome picture because we recognize that in a fraction of a second this is over with, right? So, a couple of pet peeves I have for silhouette. They usually relate to getting your character away from the bind pose. This is the way you will open the character, and most of the silhouette pet peeves come from the fact that you haven't manipulated the rig far enough away from this, right? So stuff like, I call it boat paddle hands, just fix it, right? Just relax those a little bit, right? Parallel feet, like just get some variety in there, fix it, right? This one's a little bit more based off of the camera. Like if your camera angle is like this, just get a little bit of turn on that and fix it. Something else in silhouette that often happens is you'll see parts of the character coincidentally interacting with other elements in the background. So all of these points here, it's like the tip of the finger is touching that box, the tip of that box is touching his leg, like the top of that box is hitting the very top of his head. And these are very easy things that we can just subtly shift our character and fix. I haven't done it here, but all of those things are things that should be remedied, right? So again, back to boring old Franklin here, making his silhouette a little bit more interesting, First, we kind of break him out of that into a more interesting silhouette, fix some of those stiff elements and pet peeves, right? And now this pose is maybe a little more interesting to look at. Now, what he's doing, who knows? Maybe he's walking along the boardwalk, pointing at like a hang glider or something like that. I don't know. But this pose is more interesting and more appealing to look at than the earlier ones. So, don't take my word for it. Let's ask all of the masters of art throughout history. Does it work on classic paintings? Alexander the Great rescued from the river Cydnus. Yes. Contrapposto, line of action, silhouette, right? Does it work if you're on a boat? Yes. Contrapposto, line of action, silhouette. Right? We're going to see these on all sorts of stuff. Does it work on sculptures? Yes. Contrapposto, line of action. I feel like from a different angle you'd see a stronger line of action on this one. And silhouette. Right. What if you're naked playing musical instruments? Contrapposto, line of action, silhouette. Right. We're seeing these throughout. This is not a new idea. This is not digital media related, or not related. This is not digital media discovered. This has been something that artists have been focusing on for years. These are not new concepts. Does it work if you're hugging a duck? Yes. Contrapposto, line of action, silhouette. Our little poster child here again, contrapposto, line of action, silhouette. In fact, Michelangelo is super famous for a reason. He is absolutely incredible at pose. You can take the Sistine Chapel ceiling and find thousands of examples, well, hundreds of examples in there. Contrapposto, line of action, silhouette. So much so that you are you already know what this painting is, like what this is, right? Like this is possibly some of the most famous poses of all time. And what I feel like it's important to draw attention to is in the quality of this silhouette. Like, look at that toe. Right? Like, how many of us would have just drawn like a blobby toe shape, right? No, his toe has a beautiful silhouette, right? Like, it is, like, this is not coincidental. This is something that was crafted. You could practically pick out individual muscles from the silhouette, right? And this is all throughout here, right? Contrapposto, line of action, silhouette. And if you break apart all of these little cherubim back here and look at their contrapposto and line of action and silhouette, they're all good too, right? So fast forward to traditional animation, right? Sheriff of Nottingham, again, this is Milk Call, a great contrapposto, line of action, silhouette, right? In video games, we see it all the time, contrapposto, line of action, silhouette, right? It's one of my favorite things. I read a lot of digital comics, so whenever I find an awesome pose, I just do like a screenshot of it and save it. This is where X-23 Laura first encounters Wolverine, right, Logan. And I just love this drawing, right? Even if you know nothing about this, it tells you so much about what's happening in this fight, both emotionally and like physically, right? So you get this contrapposto. And you can see that he's getting this twist happening here, right, where he's twisting at the torso. They have these two lines of action where it feels like his line of action is sort of pushing against hers, and like they're getting this conflict, right? You can almost feel the point of tension there where like he's got a hold of like her shoulder and pushing that, right? This line of action that shows very clearly where these two very dangerous arms are, right? And this line of action that shows she's kind of pushing that away. All of these lines of action in the leg, and then this just awesome silhouette, right? So here, contrapposto, line of action. I love what we see just in this line of action is that we see the power capabilities just in the way this is set up. This very small character threatening this very large character who could very easily throw him through a wall, and later does. And then you get this line of action where his boss is practically poking him in the face with that little bitty finger, right? Like it just carries so much weight in these two poses. And then this strong silhouette that just shows the difference between the two of them. Ariel is an awesome character to me for this. Very clear contrapposto, right? But she has this tail that continues the line of action all the way out through, through like even the extent of her leg. And then she has this very clear silhouette because of her hair and tail, right? Like her hair just makes this giant flaming mass in space around her head, right? The contrast between these two characters and their poses, right? Contrapposto and line of action. And then we get this extra line of action just in this pose that goes straight up through Sully's arm, right? And then this silhouette where we see one is smooth and round and the other one is like bulky and furry, right? Brad Bird is incredible at this. He actually did a stretch in on The Simpsons where he did whole lectures and whole like revisions. There's a memo that's out there on the internet that Brad Bird wrote for The Simpsons on how to improve their staging. And so if you look at this, Contrapposto, line of action, Contrapposto, line of action, and this strong silhouette. I love, like, in this character, he kind of gets 3 Contrappostos. We get this extra set of shoulders up there for his eyes, and angling those, like, contrary to each other, makes him feel kind of goofy, right? He's like a little like, and this like contrasting line of action. I didn't notice this on the silhouette that I didn't fill in his eyes, so it's a little like creepy looking when you see that. Now, some shots are like, oh, I don't see the whole character, it's just a face, right? But all of this stuff can still be relevant in this pose, right? Contrapposto, line of action, these 2 nice swooping lines of action in the face and the silhouette. That's my wrap it up, Greg alarm. Okay, so we're getting close actually. I'm going to move on to one more piece. This is actually one of my favorites, slowly becoming one of my favorites in history, just in this pose, right? I love the composition of this. You'll hear me talk about this later, but the phi ratio, instead of using rule of thirds, this is another way to form composition, is with these phi spirals. So it's got this beautiful composition to begin with, but if we just start breaking apart these 2 poses, we got Contrapposto and Contrapposto, making this almost parentheses of line of action. And what is it? What is inside of that parentheses? That box, right? They're making this parentheses around this box. And what is in that box? Nothing anymore. They're all over here on Bonnie's side of the parentheses, right? Spoiler alert, Bonnie gets the toys. And like, then we get this line of, or this silhouette that is beautiful, right? And then we get this, like, look at Andy's arm, right? It starts here in his shoulders, or like at Ham, and travels down his arm, and look what he's pointing at. Pointing at Woody. Right? And if you follow up her arm to her face and out her eyes, she's looking like admirably at this other kid who's telling her how to use her toy, how to play with these toys. And like, it's just got this like awesome line of action that's just flowing through the whole thing, right? It's just a great piece. So that's how we address line of action, Contrapposto, silhouette. But I'm going to spring one more on you here, which is exaggeration. Now, exaggeration is relevant to all of this. When I was making this, I was like, I wonder how big I can make it before it gets too big. And the phrase I use for exaggeration, you've probably even heard me say this, is push it until you break it, right? And that's what we're going to do for our poses too. It's very easy to adjust our line of action, Contrapposto, or silhouette, and be like, there, I'm done. But are you? So take it and push it a little further and see if it makes it better. So we'll start with an emotion like fear, right? If I were going to try to show fear in a pose, maybe this would be my first attempt at it, right? And this reads as a, like, oh crap, did I remember to mail my taxes? Like that's how that reads as fear. It's not like mortal fear, right? This is like, I'm not sure if I did that or not. So it reads enough as fear, but we can push it, right? We can make it stronger. So we push it a little bit more, and this is maybe reading a little more clearly as fear now. Now he's like, crap, I just got an email from the IRS. I didn't mail my taxes, right? And then it's like, that's not broken yet, right? Could it be stronger? Well, it's really easy to find out. Push it a little bit more and just see, right? Like, worst case scenario, save the file first, push it and see if it gets better. And if I push it a little bit more, it's, oh, the IRS is at the door. No, he doesn't live here. Oh, no. So, it's still not broken, right? I kept pushing it, and it got better. So push it again. This could be my final pose, but I want to push it again and just see, can I make it more afraid, right? And at first when I did this, when I was like, that's it, that's my broken pose. And then I was like, wait, but it's not for every animation, right? It's not for Hotel Transylvania or Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, where they go really exaggerated with stuff, right? So still not broken. Push it a little bit more. And now it's broken, so Control Z, right? And that's odd. It really does. I've done this multiple times. Having people do sketches of poses, and they push it and they like it more, and they push it a little bit more and they like it even better. So keep pushing it. Don't accept your first attempt at it. Keep trying to make it stronger and stronger, right? So. Questions and comments. That's me. I keep forgetting to delete this slide. Still sort of a leftover from that. Any questions on any of this? Let's check my time. 12:30. 4:30. I keep getting 12. 4:34. Did it. Yes, daylight savings time. I don't like it. I'm actually going to let you all out here in just a minute. I want to give you an exercise, and it's all about pose. In fact, I can Jack, you asked for the version of it up on the network. So I'll go ahead and go up to our Animation Fundamentals folder. You can too. And under DIGM classes, I'll go ahead and paste this into Anim Fund under Resources. And something else you'll see in Resources is this new folder called BinBot. Now, you'll get a chance to check it out here in a minute. Let me show you BinBot. There's a couple of things to learn about him. First, this is BinBot. It's Bob Bot's older brother, right? Materials are a little bit better. It renders a little bit better. And if you go up there to the Resources folder, you'll just want to drag this whole thing down because there's a bunch of textures in there as well, right? But if I go under Images, I want to show you just sort of the render options for BinBot that are in here. Sorry, that's where I'm copying that file. It'll be done in just a second here. There we go. So some of you will notice that substance yellow material that is always used. So these are like a couple of the different materials if you want to swap them out, right? And I can sort of scrub through here, see like the different materials. All of those are in this file. All of them are in here. If you go to the material editor, here you'll see all 4 of them right there. And there's even an older version of the material in here too. The way you apply these is if you want to try one of those other materials on here, you select all of the mesh, which is under this bot mesh thing here. So just select all of those, right click on one of these and say assign to selected. So you can try one of the other materials. So you can use whichever one you want for this exercise. If I go to show and turn on my NURBS curves, so I want to show you, there's 2 different versions of BinBot in this folder. Under scenes, you'll see version 1.7 and version 1.8. Hopefully by next class period, I'm going to try to have 1.9 or 2.0 in there, where I can add just a little bit of eye deformation in there for those of you who want to get some emotion out of it. The rig is really pretty solid. I use this for a lot of stuff. It's the Setup Machine 3. You get a couple of things in here. You get this spine control here that moves that. And the thing that's impressive about this is if you're using this blue one on the bottom, notice that his arms stay in the same orientation. Versus if you use this yellow control, they do not, right? They move with the character. That's really nice because sometimes you get your character in an arm pose that you want to keep, but then you adjust the spine and it messes it up. So right now his arms will stay sort of relative to his spine. We have full FK and IK arms, right? We have this FK arm, this little ring that's kind of floating out in front here. This is sort of a clavicle for him. It's your call if you really need to use that or not. I probably wouldn't do too much with it because you'll start to see some texture issues under there. The legs are automatically set to IK here, right? Couple of things, you can aim the knee this way by rotating this arrow, or you can grab this ball and move it to aim the knee. So both of those will work to aim the knee. And you'll see that the foot has a couple of things. We have this end control here, which will let us roll up on the toe. We have this control, which lets us roll up on the ball of the foot. And then this platform down here at the bottom, which allows us to move the entire foot. And you'll see that it rotates on the heel, right? But you'll also notice on that control, there's tons of other foot attributes here. We got toe raise, we got heel raise, we got heel swivel, we got some stretch controls. They don't really work very well because he's a robot and robots don't stretch. So there's a lot of different things in here. One thing we do have in here that I'll show you, I added some eye controls. I don't know if you'll even really need to use them, but you can. You'll see that it gets like some weird stuff going on there. But if you need a little bit of motion in the eye, I wanted to give you some stuff for that. What I'd like to do, and what I'll probably have in the next version, is one of these controls will have a series of blend shapes for the eyes, so you can get sort of a surprised or a crinkle to the eyes. It may actually be on the eye control, but I'll show you that change later. Now, the last thing I'll show you that's kind of neat, all of the spine has all of the controls have both FK and IK versions. So let's say I get my character into this pose here. I need some skinning fixed there. Let's say I get the character into this pose, right? And I'm like, oh wait, I need this to be an IK. Right? Well, the FK-IK switch for the arms is on this yellow control here. So you'll see right here, right arm FK-IK switch. And if I blend that back to 1, it takes the character out of that pose, right? So one of the things, now he's an IK, but he's an IK in the wrong pose. He's like down here somewhere, right? So one of the ways we can fix that is if I right-click anywhere on the arm, well, it's an I. Oh, maybe I don't have to, maybe it's up here now. If I go up here to TSMG controls. No. Yeah, TSM3 controls. It's the FK-IK switch. And if I click that, it will just switch his arm to IK in that new pose. That's actually a really awesome feature. We'll kind of look at the reasons for that later. The last thing I would say is on the hand, all the finger controls. This first little lollipop-shaped control, that's the first joint. And you'll see that it also has some middle and end joints here to get some curl, or you can animate these things individually. So that'll allow you to get the hand in all sorts of different poses, even if it is just like this mitten hand. So I will say, if you have issues with this one, there's the older version of the rig, which is actually a different rig. If I open this, version 1.7 is a slightly different rig. It was the setup machine for games. This is the setup machine 3. I think the setup machine 3 is better, but if you find a bunch of issues or something messes up on it, you can always use this version too. What are you going to be using it for is the big question, right? So let's look at the exercise. This is actually a pretty fun one because you're just going to be making still images. So under the exercises, we scroll down here and we are at exercise 4, 5 poses. So again, poses are one of the most important elements of communicating clearly with your animation. Plus you need practice with a rig, right? So just like I had you practice with the hobo rig, this is kind of your way of practicing with this rig. So what I want is, using BinBot, create 5 rendered pose images that alone communicate an emotion or state of being. So sad, scared, strong, defeated, worried. You can pick whatever emotion or state of being you want, right? It's your call what you choose. But a person should be able to identify the emotion without being told what it is. Okay? Name the files, pose A.jpg, pose B.jpg. And the reason for that is because we're going to look at those in class. We're going to click through them, want to pick sort of a random sampling of them. We're going to click through them, and we're going to see if you can recognize them just from the pose. Right? If I click a pose, are you going to be able to say, oh, he's sad, or he's devastated, right? So that's by next class period. Actually, my date on here is wrong. It says Thursday, November 1st. We're going to do this by, it'll actually be November 8th. Okay. Aced. All right. So that's the exercise, just a little homework of stuff to work on. Now, one more thing. I need you to check your email. I haven't sent it yet. I need you to check your email tonight. I'm going to send you, maybe even earlier, probably tonight. I'm going to send you all a link to something, which is a form I want you to fill out. I kind of wanted to get that to you today, but it kind of slipped through the cracks here. That form is for our final project. Okay, so again, I mentioned our final project I do as a group project. So this is how I'm going to sort of break you up into groups. Trust me on it. It works out good this way. I take your questions or I take your opinions into consideration. And so one of the questions is there a person you want to be in a group with? Is there a person you do not want to be in a group with? And so we'll talk a little bit more about the final next class period, but what I'd like to have is, if you can get that filled out, I can get you broken up into groups and let you know who your group is. It'll be a group somewhere between 3 to 4 people, but don't sweat it. Like, your group members can't mess up your grade. You're still graded on your work, so don't sweat that too much. Any questions on this? All right, cool. Class dismissed. The rest of the class is yours. I gotta go count some cows, so I'm gonna head out here after I upload this video.